everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing drafting 5-color in MKM. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So, getting into it, as I see it, the real reason that 5-color is so good in this format is because it allows you to play rares, like a lot of rares, and I was wondering how many more rares there actually are in the set, because the composition of the new play boosters is somewhat new at the very least, and a little confusing. So I tried to do a little bit of research, and it looks to me like each pack has an average of a little under 1.3 non-land rares, and then there's also a rare land in every 6 packs in addition to that. This is based on a blog post I saw that claimed that 30% of the time there would be an extra rare, 4% of the time there would be an extra mythic. 1 in 6, so 16.6 repeating percent of the time there's a land. So if you subtract the lands and add the other stuff, looks like 1.3 rares per pack, which is appreciably but not radically more rares than there are in other sets with bonus sheets. I don't actually know the math on how many rares there are on average in a pack of Strixhaven, but I think it's fewer than that. Also, around 42% of non-land rares are multicolor, which means that there's a pretty good chance, if most people at the table are drafting 2 colors, that most players will have to pass most of those multicolor rares, especially in packs 2 and 3. And that means that the rares are going to go a little bit later on average, in addition to there being more of them, which combined means that you're going to see quite a few more rares, especially multicolor rares, in an average draft. And so it's going to be a lot more consistent that you'll be able to build a deck around having a lot of rares if you can draft the mana that will support that. That won't always work. There are rares. There's a reasonable amount of variance in how many are opened at the table, and also if other people are taking fixing, they might be able to splash some of those rares, which is just more reason that you really, really need to prioritize taking the fixing, especially the lands that let people splash early on in this strategy, so that other people at your table are not in a position to splash the rares that they open, and then they're more likely to have to pass them to you, and you're more likely to get to play more of them. So if you want, you could think of it like every land you take early gives you some additional portion of future rares in expectation by making it harder for other people at the table to cast those rares. Just something to think about in terms of the pick order there. So that's kind of like the general why should you do this, although for me, a lot of the time recently that I've been doing it, the reason is because I see Niv Mizzet early in the draft, and I know that the format lets me cast Niv Mizzet, so I just take it because it's pretty strong, and then I take the cards to support it. And having done that a bunch, I'm starting to have a pretty good understanding of what things are important in these decks. So a little bit more baseline about the format as it's starting to take shape and we're starting to get some decent 17 lands data. Red-white is an early favorite by a lot. It's pretty rare for an archetype to win over 60% of the time, which red-white is currently doing. That means that red-white, in general, I'm going to assume that the successful red-white decks are aggressive decks, specifically using the 3 different commons that make multiple creatures that are available to red-white, the detective that the 1/1 citizen that makes a detective for 3 in white, the 2/2 suspect that makes a detective for 4 in red, and Dogwalker in red-white, the 3/1 that flips over to make 2 1/1s. So it makes it very easy for red-white to go very wide, and then on the job, the 4 mana instant that gives all of their creatures +2/0 and makes a clue. If you curve out a few of those, make multiple creature things, and on the job, it's really, really hard for decks that are trying to engage 1-for-1 with your creatures to not be in a spot where they have to like throw away a lot of their board and or take lethal when you on the job. I might have misspoken. +2/+1. That means like the format can be fast. Looking at the 17 Lands data on speed of formats, this format so far has ended on turn 9 on average, which is very, very, very slightly below the average turn, which is probably more like 9.2 or something. So it's a pretty normal speed, slightly on the fast side. So anyway, you want a low curve, especially if you have a lot of powerful rares. You really just need to make sure that you're not too far behind and you have time to cast those rares, and then those rares presumably are going to be able to take over the game. That's why you're trying to play them. So like in a lot of formats where you prioritize cheap removal, you're kind of trying to use cheap removal to generate a small game, and then often you want to pair that with some source of card advantage so that you kind of give yourself time to use your card draw spells and increase their relative impact on the remaining resources in the game, and kind of win through attrition by killing all your opponent's stuff. Here, there's not really a lot of like raw card advantage, like divination type spells that are available or that you're interested in. Instead, you're basically just looking to not lose and then win on card quality by just playing the powerful rares that you have. Again, that's really what's going on. So bombs and removal is the basic archetype here. That's the core strategy. That's the name of the game. So to jump around in my notes a little bit here, your basic general pick order is bombs. You want to take these rares that are kind of the driving principle here, followed by fixing. Again, well, there's a lot of reasons to take fixing this highly. Both it cuts other people off of playing the bombs, as I was talking about. It sets you up to take all of them, and also the set's pretty deep on playables. When you're playing every color, you're not really going to not have enough cards to play, even if you value lands pretty highly. And the next thing that you want is removal, and it seems that removal is generally going pretty late in this format. There is a bunch of like pretty good and pretty cheap removal that decks like the red-white deck I was just describing are not very interested in, which means that if you take a like piece of fixing over a removal spell, you'll have other opportunities to find a removal spell. So it generally feels pretty safe to not be super selective about which removal spells you take and just value it, but not more than the key fixing, and it'll work out. When I say the key fixing, what I really mean is the lands. There are several different kinds of fixing available in this set. There are the Surveil lands at rare, the Clue land at uncommon, which is pretty good, and then the 5-color land at common and the Evolving Wilds Escape Tunnel at common. And in addition to the lands, there is the colorless 1/3 gargoyle thing that can filter colored mana. That is a playable if your mana needs the help, but not a priority, Gravestone Strider. You don't have to take it highly because basically no one else is going to want it. You don't want very many of them because it's an acceptable blocker, but if you draw it when your mana doesn't need the help, it's a bad card. You can get that pretty late. You can play one or two of them, but you really should not be prioritizing it. And then there are 3 common mana fixers in green. There's Nervous Gardener, which I think is the best of them. That's a 2-mana 2/2, or if you morph it, or disguise it, you can spend a green, flip it over, and search for a land with a basic land type. Notably, if you have Gardeners, you should look for Surveil lands that are not green, and then the Gardener can find 2 of your colors at the same time. There's also Topiary Panther, which has basic land cycling for 1 and a green, and then it's also a 6/5 Trampler for 6. And then there is They Went This Way or something like that, which searches for a basic land, and puts it into play and investigates, which is I think the worst of them because of how crowded threes are in this format, but I think the 5-color deck can be drafted to have a lot of twos and then some expensive things, and it can play pretty reasonably. But I don't think that you need to fight over the green cards too much, especially if you have some of the lands. You just don't really need all that many spells dedicated to fixing unless you need them. You don't want your deck to be all those green cards. So it's reasonable to take premium removal over those green cards, and then the green cards kind of over most other stuff. So after you have your bombs, your fixing, and your removal, you're looking for cheap creatures that block well, especially 2-drops, but also, 3 or 4 mana creatures that block particularly well. Maybe they have evasion, maybe they have flying or reach or some kind of inherent value. Cold Case Cracker does multiple of those things at the same time, but it's not really cheap. After that, more expensive creatures that block well, like Cold Case Cracker, and then all other creatures. You do really want to prioritize creatures that block well specifically. Like, I think I think Red Herring is a pretty good card, but not something that you want in this deck because you don't really care about getting some early damage in. You're basically just trying to live and win with whatever it is your rares do. Among cheap removal, instant is a lot better than not instant, but 2 mana is a lot better than more than 2 mana. So, for example, I think I prefer the black sorcery edict to murder because murder's double black and more mana. Also, I prefer it over like the white instant that kills a high power creature, artifact, or enchantment. Though that's also acceptable. The edict is very good. In general, like, murder is going to depend on whether black is acceptable. Early on, I would prefer to take something like a Galvanize over murder because it's going to be easier on my mana. And again, being able to use 2 mana at a time is very valuable. But all of that stuff I would not be unhappy to have in my deck. Not all bombs are rares. Like, I would consider Coerced to Kill, the blue-black 3 uncommon control magic that makes it a 1/1 and gives it Death Touch, to be a bomb for our purposes. Overall, you're looking to have a low curve. Like, you want to have, I think, 10 or more cards that cost less than 3 mana. The number of cards that cost more than 3 mana that you want is basically just whatever bombs you get that cost that much, plus any other like premium cards. But you're looking to not play filler that costs 4 or more mana because you just really don't want to fall behind, and you're not looking to spend more mana to have something that's like a little bit more powerful. You want all of your more expensive plays to be these like rares that are a lot more powerful. Among the common lands, relevantly, if you look at the win rates for the common lands on 17 lands, you'll see that Escape Tunnel is a much better card than Public Thoroughfare in general in the format. It's a much stronger card. However, in 5-color, the stats flip. Public Thoroughfare actually has a much better win rate in 5-color than Escape Tunnel. Having a single land that covers all of your colors when you're trying to actually play 5 colors, rather than needing to pick which color you want to be able to cast, can be really, really big. I've certainly had spots where I'm playing 5-color, and even though I can search for 2 different basic lands, it's still really awkward to cast my spells in a way that it wouldn't be if I just had a Public Thoroughfare. So, Public Thoroughfare, I think it's pretty dangerous to play 4 of them. I think you probably would be happy to play 3 of them. I might take my first Escape Tunnel over my 3rd Public Thoroughfare, but Public Thoroughfare should be considered better than Escape Tunnel at most stages of the draft while drafting 5-color, which means it's very rare that you want to pass a Public Thoroughfare if you suspect that you're going to be playing 5-color. The uncommon split cards, just in general, are very good for this archetype because they're all pretty, like, very easy to cast and let you do something useful for not very much mana. So Flotsam and Jetsam and Cease and Desist are solid 2 mana plays that put something good in the graveyard for collect evidence and can do something stronger later in the game. Push Pull is a premium removal, like roughly the best removal spell, because push is very easy to cast, pull is very strong. It's another way to have like something useful and cheap that also gives you something like really strong to do in the late game. And then the other two, Fuss and Bother. Fuss is not very useful in this kind of strategy. It pumps attacking creatures. Bother is nice, but not great. I'm not really looking to play Fuss and Bother. And then the other one, the one that makes something block or pumps your team, I think you're not really interested in at all. So I guess 3 of the split cards are good. One of them is great. One of the three that are good is great. But the 2 that are not great, you still want pretty highly, just because of their flexibility and utility in collecting evidence. In general, you are not looking to prioritize common discover creatures because you would like to play something larger than a 2/2 on turn 3 because you're looking for a way to be ahead rather than at parity or behind in those early turns to maximize your chances that you get to the later stage where you can play your good rares. That said, sometimes you are going to want to play disguised creatures. You just like won't see other good things or whatever, and some of the disguised creatures are fine to cast at other points in the curve. If you are going to play common disguised creatures, they should be chosen from among Dogwalker, the red-white 3/1 that makes 2 dogs, Fairy Snoop, the blue-black 1/4 that looks at 2 cards and puts 1 in your hand and 1 in the graveyard, Gadget Technician, the blue-red 3/1 that makes a 1/1, and Sanguine Savior, the 2/1 lifelink flyer that can give something else lifelink when it turns over. Those ones are the most efficient to flip over. The best for... Sorry, this is specifically among the gold commons. There are other disguised creatures that you want, including Nervous Gardener and higher rarity cards. But if you're going to be playing generic multicolor disguised creatures, you want these ones rather than the larger ones because of the immediate value. Like it's better to get some kind of extra value than to have a big creature. And the red-black one that kind of gives you extra value is a little too expensive. And the extra blocker offered by Walker and Technician is kind of, extra life, just very useful. Sanguine Savior can give you a big life jump to buy you a lot of time. And Fairy Snoop blocks pretty well and gives you extra cards, which is the kind of thing that a controlling deck is looking for. Because there is mana fixing in green and you're usually going to need to play it, you should expect to have more forests than other basic lands in your deck, which means that you're going to want your early plays to be green where possible. The Tunnel Tipster is acceptable but not ideal because it's more mana that's never fixing. Like you have to have green to cast it, and then it taps for green. So if you're playing a bunch of fixing, you're kind of playing extra mana sources, and you want the extra mana sources to help you have mana variety. Tunnel Tipster doesn't do that. It's still useful just because of being a 2-drop and getting you ahead on mana is a good way to not be behind, but the mana that it's giving you is a little bit worse than it looks if your like fixing situation is iffy, or if you're playing like a lot of other, like I'd rather have a Nervous Gardener than a Tunnel Tipster, and I would accept that sometimes I'm just going to play the Nervous Gardener as a 2-drop if I don't need the fixing, or if there's any risk that I'd be falling behind, or if I don't have another 2 mana play. Similarly, I'm a pretty big fan of the green 1/3 reach with Collect Evidence 6 that gains 2 life and puts a +1/+1 counter on something, just as a way to have an early blocker that can give you a little bit of value in the late game. It's helpful if you can choose a secondary color that you're usually going to like look for that color of mana after you have your green, and then you can play early creatures in that color, but it doesn't always work out that way, and it's not always necessary. I talked about prioritizing Surveil lands to go with Nervous Gardener to make it better fixing. Also, if you can find green Surveil lands, then those can make Flourishing Bloomkin, the uncommon that searches for 2 forests. They can turn that card into fixing. It's not very good in 5-color decks if it only finds forests, but if it can find lands of other colors because you have 1 or especially 2 green Surveil lands, then it actually becomes a really good card in these decks, since they kind of want a high forest count a lot of the time anyway, to make sure that your fixing is on. So Flourishing Bloomkin can be very bad or very good, mostly as a function of the presence of Surveil forests in your deck. Case of the Shattered Pact, the uncommon 2-mana case that searches for a land, is really, really strong if you can solve it. If you don't expect to be able to solve it, it's playable but not good mana fixing. You would generally prefer not to play it. You'd rather play like a Topiary Stomper, whatever it's called, Panther, I don't remember, instead. And then if you can solve it, it's game winning. The easiest ways to solve it are with Niv Mizzet. You can also use a Killer Among Us, which will give you every color except black. If you have a Killer Among Us and Case of the Shattered Pact in your deck. So a Killer Among Us is a very good card that's not very good in 5-color because it needs you to attack to like really get what it's offering. However, the interaction with Case of the Shattered Pact is good enough that if I have Shattered Pact, then I want a Killer Among Us. And then if I have both of them, I want to prioritize just kind of whatever cheap black permanents I can find to maximize the chance that I can solve the case when I have a Killer Among Us. The other way that you can solve Case of the Shattered Pact is with Leyline of the Guildpact, which is not a card that I want to play, even if I'm 5-color. Notably, it's particularly awkward with Niv, as it turns off Niv's triggered ability. You will never have a card that's exactly 2 colors while Leyline of the Guildpact is in play. But if you have particularly multiple Case of the Shattered Pacts, then I think Leyline of the Guildpact is good because it fixes your mana in general and also automatically solves Case of the Shattered Pact, and doing that so strong. There are a lot of strong uncommons that are build-arounds, cards like Chalk Outline and Detective Satchel, that ask you to do some work and give you some kind of engine as a reward. I think that you do not want to prioritize these or intend to play these or draft around these in 5-color decks. You have enough to juggle as is, looking for your fixing, your removal, and your bombs, as well as making your early game coherent, that you don't want to also be looking to complete the package of synergistic cards required to make those cards work. This also applies to most cases. They're generally asking you to do some particular thing that isn't the thing that you want to do, such as Filched Falcon at least. You generally want to try to draft your deck to care as little as possible about basically every synergy. If you have a really strong rare that pushes you to care about a creature type or something, you could, but for the most part, you are really just looking for fixing, bombs, and removal in your 5-color decks. There is a completely different deck and way of drafting that is synergy deck that is drafted around one of these cards that happens to be playing 5-color. There are some, for example, Insidious Roots decks that will end up splashing cards of other colors and playing 5 color. That will happen when you're drafting around such a card and you happen to see fixing late and you happen to end up with very powerful cards of every color. More likely, those decks are going to end up being 2 to 4 color. The key here is the synergy decks need to be drafted as those synergy decks, and then from there they can splash other cards. What you don't want is to be drafting a 5-color deck, like one where you take Niv early or do any of what I'm talking about, and then part of the way through the draft, like late in pack 1 or early in pack 2, try to get into one of those synergistic cards and bend your deck to support it. If you are in a place where you start around a synergy card, it is okay to adopt extra colors as appropriate while drafting around your core synergy. If you are starting from drafting 5-color good stuff or bombs and removal or however you want to think about it, adding in heavy synergies as an afterthought part of the way through the draft is a recipe for a train wreck. So there will be times when you can play build around like Insidious Roots in decks that have 5 colors of cards, but usually the workflow there is going to start from the synergistic card and spiral out into more colors because the draft happens to lead you that way, rather than start from 5-color and narrow into a synergy. I think, if you are already in a space where you have good rares, you should expect to have enough power from the natural stuff that your 5-color deck is giving you, rather than trying to increase your power level by chasing these build rounds. I think that this point is very important, even though it's kind of weird that you can, I'm saying you can end up in a 5-color deck, but the path matters. But I think it really does. And I will cover paths toward drafting around the synergy pieces later, and will likely comment on how easily each of those decks can splash and how to do it in other episodes. But this is a specific archetype that is best when it avoids trying to do that kind of thing. And I think that basically covers my kind of core points and thesis about how to draft how and why to draft these 5-color decks. So that's going to wrap it up, and I'm going to turn it over to chat for questions. As always, while I'm letting people think of those and give me questions to talk about, I want to thank my newest patrons. So thank you very much, Rod and Igor. Appreciate the support. As always, everyone else, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes if you are interested in supporting the podcast and getting some of the benefits offered there. For details about what those are, it's easiest to just go to patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. I do still offer coaching and discounted coaching rates there, as well as some other perks. Have I been able to make much use of Aftermath Analyst in my 5-color decks? I have done some of that, because it is a base green card that is a good blocker and does some amount of fixing by itself, and is especially good with Escape Tunnel. Aftermath Analyst is the 1 and a green, 1/3 ETB mill 3, spend 3 and a green, sack it to return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield. Yeah, it is. I think it's probably better to think about it more as a cheap creature that blocks well than as actual fixing, but I have liked having it in my 5-color decks. Does the drawback on Public Thoroughfare impact my deck building in any way? I do certainly prefer to have cheap artifacts, especially clues, if I have Public Thoroughfare, but I wouldn't say it has a large impact on my deck building. Some portion of the time you're going to take off turn 2 to play it, and that'll be okay. Some portion of the time you're going to find another way to handle it. Any cards that are generally considered very good but for 5 colors should be avoided. Anything that is good specifically because it attacks well, or that is good despite requiring several mana symbols of the same color, or is good because of the ability to deeply support its synergy, or is good because it's efficient, like it's a good 2-drop, but it's gold and of colors that are known to not be your primary colors, would be the kinds of cards that I might not prioritize even though they're strong. How do I interpret the low win rate of Flotsam and Jetsam? It is certainly weaker than Push-Pull, for example, and in general, it is best in, like, it wants to go in slow decks and or self-mill decks, and I suspect it is primarily played in self-mill decks, which I suspect have low win rates in general, due both to their not being as strong, I think, as like the Boros decks, but also, and very importantly, being much harder to draft and much easier to like just not have things come together properly. Imagine you open a bomb, pack 1, pick 1, say Aurelia's Vindicator. Pack 1, pick 2, you get an off-color duel. Do you take it over a decent on-color card to pursue 5-color? I would say that a lot of that just depends on the preferences that you expect to have for the rest of the draft, and like how meaningful the on-color card is. If you have exactly Aurelia's Vindicator, I think it would be reasonable to take an off-color dual land, or just like a good common Boros card, depending on where you like to end up. Am I taking Thoroughfare and or Tunnel over top split cards, push-pull early when you already have a reason to be in the 5-color direction? No, I think unless it's late enough that I know that I need the fixing, I would take push-pull specifically over Tunnel and Thoroughfare. Push-pull is pretty close to bomb category for me, but I would be taking like, similarly, like, it's close between, like, I guess early on I would take Thoroughfare over Lightning Helix if I'm like pretty sure that I'm going to be 5-color, but I would not take push-pull, but I would not take them over push-pull because push-pull is so much easier to cast. I'm surprised by the awful stats on Illicit Masquerade, but it's 1 black pip, makes it easily splashable in black and can recycle bombs. Why do I think it performs so poorly? I don't know why it performs so poorly. It obviously requires some amount of setup. In my experience, it has not required very much and has played really well. Again, I think that it's just that what has succeeded early is the decks that are extremely straightforward and very easy to understand and very easy to draft, and that's like these Boros aggro decks and Illicit Masquerade. I think both want some amount of effort to set it up, and the like green-black decks that are best at setting it up are, again, I think most difficult to draft. So I imagine some combination of its potential to let you draw your cards in the wrong order and its potential to lead to just like mistakes in drafting, or just the archetype could just fundamentally be that much worse than the other decks. If you're low on haymakers like Niv after having a stable mana base, would you look to pick up ways to protect your bombs with recursion or hexproof effects, or would you be fine looking for generic and top-end common flyers? So I did play a deck that had some bombs and tried to protect them with the 2-mana blue flight that gives hexproof. And after playing it, I think my conclusion is that I would prefer not to play that card again. I would rather just like have other cards, let my opponent kill my rares, and try to have more rares to play rather than trying to set up spots where I can protect my creatures. It just makes like the having the mana available to do it is not easy, and it leads to a lot of potential awkwardness. I've gotten into trouble playing disguised creatures like Dogwalker, Gadget, and Gadget Tech when I'm only solidly in one of the colors, essentially making them double pipped to flip. What kind of color distribution affects my willingness to play these sorts of cards one way or another? So, because so many of the fixing effects, like almost all of them, ask you to search for a land, I really want to avoid something like Murder that costs black because I don't want to have to search for my second swamp. But because all of these things that you're saying function as double pip, like usually I'm looking to find both mountain and plains, and so I will end up flipping Dogwalker for red white most of the time if I'm 5 color. Certainly, if one of them costs 2 colors and they're the 2 colors that are my lowest priority, I would prefer not to play that and to play a different morph instead, because Dogwalker, Fairy Snoop, Gadget Tech, and Sanguine Savior cover a lot of different colors. You can usually find ones that fit your mana base pretty well. I would say, and if you have to play it as a morph and just trade it off because you're not close to being able to flip it rather than trying to flip it, I don't think that's the end of the world. So I would say, your mana base should inform which of those you play, but 5 color can like support them collectively pretty well. How highly do I recommend picking each of the 3 Wrath effects for this deck? When you see them, you should take them. They are all exactly the kind of rare bomb that I'm looking for in this strategy. How highly I would take them is over everything that is not a better rare bomb. Do I think this strategy benefits from drafting with worse players on Magic Arena? And how well do you think it would translate to high-level paper draft? Do not think that it suffers from drafting with worse players, because I would expect better players at this moment to know that 2-color aggressive white decks have done pretty well, and that multicolor and black decks have not done so well, and for them to be trying to get into the stronger decks, especially in spots where they're playing high stakes matches. And so, despite the fact that this is possible, I do not expect it to be popular, and I think that the cards that I want will generally be available for me. In what situation would you expect to go into 5-color early compared to 3 to 4? When I have 5 different colors of bombs and or premium removal spells. In both cases, I'm prioritizing fixing early and taking good cards regardless of color, and then it's just a matter of like, it happens to like at the end of the draft I might go like, oh, I actually only have 1 white removal spell, I will just not play it, or the plains, but I'm going to draft the same way. How many fixing cards is enough? So this is an interesting question. You are looking to have 9 lands that give you green mana, and then you're often looking to have pretty close to 9 ways to get each of your other colors of mana, acknowledging that you're going to be double counting a lot of sources in pretty unfair ways. So you'll count your Nervous Gardener as a land of every color except green. There's going to be some amount of wiggle room here in terms of like how much of a source is Gravestone Strider and how much like less fixing do you need if you have Public Thoroughfare than Escape Tunnel, and do you really need 9 sources of the single color that you are playing the fewest cards in? No. often the answer is that you basically want the amount of fixing that you can get, and then you make it work as well as you can. But while you don't know, like, if you're not sure what you should be targeting and how highly to prioritize stuff, I think a solid baseline is look for 9 lands that tap for green, and then counting all of your fix, 9 ways to get each of your other colors, and you should be pretty safe. And I don't think so. As far as cards that cost 2 of the same mana symbol, especially if that mana symbol is not green, I think that they basically need to be bombs to play them, except possibly for, like, you can choose a single color that you plan to do that for, but you need a really good, like, it's better to not do that. You could choose black and you could play 2 murders and one of the 5 mana 3/3, the eliminator that sacks the thing to exile something, and that would be acceptable. Or if you have the white or black wrath, then you could also play some other card that needs double white or double black. But for the most part, you should place a very, very high penalty on the second symbol of a color, and like, note that it existing is dangerous for your mana base, especially if you are relying more on escape tunnels than public thoroughfares. Ezrim is a great question. So Ezrim is a very, very, very powerful bomb. Vein Ripper is another one that's roughly the same situation as Ezrim. They're both very strong bombs that have a lot of colored mana symbols that are not green. Ezrim and Vein Ripper would both make me less likely to try to draft this deck. I would try to play fewer colors if I had drafted those cards. And if I do have them and I'm trying to play this deck, they will make me prioritize Public Thoroughfare and Gravestone Strider much more highly than other fixing, because the fact that you don't need to choose a single color and that they can fix for the second pip of that while also fixing for cards that are not their color becomes really important. I think that it is conceivable to build a 5-color deck with Ezrim or Vein Ripper, but unlikely, and you would generally be better off not trying to do it. Buried in the Garden is a card that I haven't talked about a lot, but goes a really, really long way, much like Strider and Public Thoroughfare. Ezrim and Vein Ripper become way more castable if your deck has, like, multiple Buried in the Gardens, for example. But while you can kind of just recklessly throw Niv into your deck, those things that cost a lot of the same color of mana are actually very difficult. I think that covers things pretty well, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I'll be back next week with some other archetype. So given the date of recording, happy Valentine's Day to those who celebrate and are not listening and are listening to this live. And I'll see everyone next week. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.